Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm sharing some quick golf scene cards using the Who's Your Caddy stamp set from Pajama Crafter Stamps. This has several different images as well as lots of sentiments to go with it. And I want to share a very simple and easy technique to create a scene in the background of stamped images using some masking sheets and some scrap paper. So the very first thing I need to do with this stamp set is remove any possible manufacturing residue. So I just use a white eraser on that stamping surface, and then I use a brush to brush off any eraser bits. I do the entire set at once, so next time I go to use this stamp set, I don't need to do that. I'm using some Hammermill Cardstock here to stamp my images. I'm going to color my actual images with Copic markers. So I'm going to be using some black Memento ink for the stamping of those images and using a Misti stamping tool in order to stamp those images and make sure I get a nice, crisp, clean image. This way, if by chance there's some areas that are a little bit lighter, I can stamp it multiple times in exactly the same spot, and I don't need to worry about mis-stamping my image. I'm going to do all three images for all three cards, and then I'm going to create the backgrounds, and then I'm going to color in my images. I'm creating some very, very simple but effective cards here using one image as well as one sentiment per card. You could always put the sentiment on the inside if you want, but I like them. They're nice and bold sentiments, a lot of them, so I thought they would work perfectly with the images that I chose for the fronts of the cards. So I have a second one here. This Memento ink that I'm using is just dye-based ink, so for cleaning my stamps, I just use a damp microfiber cloth. Don't need any fancy cleaner for that. And then I can just wipe it off before putting my stamp back in the packaging. And I'm also going to be using that same ink for stamping on my masking sheets before I fussy cut them. So here is that third image. There's actually a fourth image in the stamp set that you could create a fourth card with a completely different image from all the rest if you want. It's a golf bag. I chose to do three images or three cards. I tend to like doing things in odd numbers for some reason. So I chose three different images, my three favorites, as well as a sentiment for each one. Now, before we put our Misti stamping tool away, I'm going to be using that for stamping on the masking sheets. Now, I only really need the image stamp for all three of these images. I'm going to fussy cut them and I'm going to mask those images off before so we can create our backgrounds. Again, using that exact same ink, and it doesn't need to be a complete stamping. I can stamp it so that we just see the outline. We just need enough detail that we can see the outline of the image to fussy cut it. So if you don't stamp it perfectly the first time, but you can see enough of the outline of the image, that's good enough. This is just meant to create a mask on top of our images so that stays a nice crisp, clean white so we can color it later on. It doesn't need to be a perfect thing because it's just for keeping that protected. This masking sheet is like a post-it note with adhesive all over the back. It comes off really easily. You don't have to worry about it sticking too well to your image. So it works perfectly for this. It's a nice thin sheet. There is one side that has printing on it. That is the masking sheet backing. So we want to stamp on the white side. Now these images are simple enough shapes that it makes it pretty easy for that fussy cutting. I'm cutting right in the middle of the black line of that stamped image. There's a few areas with these images where this line kind of has a dash to it, has an opening to it. I'm just going to go straight through that. We're going to put this right on top of our stamped image on our card, and then we're going to create our backgrounds. Now, if you want to create the same card multiple times with the masking sheet and you're using all the same colors, you can use these masking sheets several times. I wouldn't recommend using different colors with them though, because the inks that I'm using are dye-based inks, water reactive inks, and using other colors with them will rehydrate those inks and you'll get a color that you don't necessarily want. So once I have my pieces fussy cut, I can put it right over top of the image. You don't even know that it's there until you go to peel it back off and you have a completely white image. So all I'm doing is matching up the images. I did the other two fussy cutting off screen because it's fairly repetitive. It's really easy to do just to cut it out. You want to make sure to use scissors that are a little bit shorter. You have an easier time getting a more accurate fussy cutting if you do that. Again, hardest part of these sheets is taking that backing off. It is, because they're so thin, sometimes it's hard to see exactly where that backing is, but it is perfect for this. You can actually get these in strips too if you wanted to create like a pinstripe type detail on your background. So once I have these done, these pieces were 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches. I'm going to take a 1/4 inch off of each edge so that they end up being 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. This is the finished size that I want them on my card. You could wait to do this step afterwards, but when we're ink blending that background, often that ink is a little bit heavier around the outside edge, and I like that look. I want that to be on my finished piece, so I'm opting to cut these down before I do that ink blending. If that is not your cup of tea and you don't really like it heavier around the edges, you can wait and do that later on. So for our very simple background scene, we're going to use printer paper, and I'm just using some, or reusing some that would have gone in the waste because it has some printing on the other side that I don't need anymore. I'm just ripping it to create a natural edge. And for this first card, we're just going to create some very, very simple sky as well as grass. So for our sky, I'm using weathered wood, faded jeans, and chipped sapphire. You can use whatever colors you're wanting. I like these 3 colors together. They're kind of a little bit of like a stormy, cloudy-ish sky. You could also use like tumbled glass, broken china. That one would be nice as well, a little bit brighter than these colors. Sometimes it just depends on the mood that I'm going for, the look that I'm going for. For a little bit of texture in my sky, I have a microfiber cloth here that is damp, and I'm just tapping it. My thought was that it would lift up more of that ink and we'd see a little bit of clouds. It didn't lift enough ink. I think I would need to have a more solid cloth in order for that to happen, but I really liked the texture that it gave, so I decided to just leave it and not redo it. For my grass, I'm using some bundled sage, peeled paint, and forest moss. I'm using 3 colors for the sky and 3 colors for the grass, but you don't necessarily need to have this many colors. You could easily do it with 2. I would definitely opt for more than 1 so that you have a little bit of color shading. Even with 1 color, you can get some light areas and some dark areas, but you can't really get it too dark. So this just adds some more visual dimension. I always like when we have some areas that are darker and some areas that are lighter. So once we're done doing that ink blending, I can take that masking off, and our golf ball and golf club here are completely white, perfect, ready for coloring once I'm done the rest of my backgrounds. For this second background, we're going to do a very similar thing. Once again, using some printer paper. Now you could take that printer paper and use some scissors and cut it. I like the jagged edges that ripping it creates, so I left it like that and wanted to create that. I want to have just a simple suggestion of a scene in the background so that our golf images are the focal point. Now this one I wanted to create a bit more of a sunset sky, so I opted to use some worn lipstick, wilted violet, and then some faded jeans so that we just have a little bit of more color to it. With just the greens and the blues, I thought it would be a little bit too plain, especially since golf balls, golf gloves don't really have a whole lot of color to them. They're more like whites and grays. So I wanted to have that color in the background. When I put the ripped part of my paper on the bottom, I'm trying to match that rip so that it joins nicely. And I'm going to use the same greens as that first card. So I'm using the bundled sage first, then I'm going in with that peeled paint just to add some darker areas towards the bottom. You can see when I'm doing my ink blending, I'm not making sure that I'm completely even all the way. I personally find it more interesting when we have some areas that are darker, some areas that are lighter. I just think it looks a little bit more visually interesting here. So here is our second one. I'm going to take that microfiber cloth, and for this one, I'm going to put that texture on the grass. I really liked the look of it on the blue, so I thought it would be great on the grass. Now, the one thing you want to make sure not to do is to accidentally have that cloth go over the sky, because as it's removing color, we're lifting some of that green into the cloth. So we want to have a little bit more control over it. So I set that aside to dry so that that can dry while I'm doing the third background. The third background, we're just going to go a little bit farther. I'm doing the greens just like the first two with that bundled sage, peeled paint, and forest moss. And I'm also going to do that sunset-y sky, but in between the grass and the sky, I'm just going to put some mountains in the back. So I have another piece of scrap paper here, and I'm just ripping the image or the shape of some mountains. I'm going to do those in the chipped sapphire, and I'm trying to make that chipped sapphire lighter towards the bottom, or sorry, darker towards the bottom, lighter towards the top, so we have some visual dimension there as well. Then I'm going to peel that up and I'm going to put the other part of that ripped edge to cover those mountains and create that sky. Now I'm doing this on my sticky mat. It makes it really, really easy because it's going to hold down that printed paper. I still use my fingers to hold that paper down to make sure it doesn't move and shift on me, especially this mountain piece, because there's not much of that sticky mat that it's sticking to. So you do want to make sure that you hold it just to control it a little bit, especially if you don't have a lot of surface of that sticky mat holding down that paper. But this technique is one of my favorite ones for creating background scenes to images, especially when you want those images to still be the focal point, but you have a supporting scene behind it. So it doesn't just look like an image floating in the air. And by doing this ink blending on the background, ink blending comes together super, super quickly. By masking those images, they're still pristine, makes it easy to color. Now, one thing I didn't think about ahead of time was the fact that we were going to have just a hand in the middle of that scene there. So if that bothers you, you can just extend it while you're cutting and create a full arm just to go towards or all the way to the edge of the cardstock. For our golf glove here, I'm using C1 and C3. It's just a really, really pale, cool gray. I'm using the C3 on all of the areas that are shaded on that glove just to blend into that C1. Again, golf gloves and golf balls don't really have a ton of color to them unless you're using colored golf balls, but I'm just going with the traditional white ones here. So I blended those together. I use that same C1 and C3 on the golf tee. I'm going to do it the same with this one here. I'm going to use that C1 and C3 on the golf tee in the grass. For a little bit of a difference with our golf ball, I'm going to use W1 and W3. That's a warm gray. That way we have different shades of gray and we have a little bit of color variation between the ball and the tee, as well as the golf club here. The golf club, I use that same C1 and C3. So here is that W1 and W3. This is for the golf ball. And I'm only doing it around the shaded edge so that most of the golf ball stays white. I'm just doing a little bit of shading on it just to give it a bit of a color variation. I thought it would look a little bit odd if we didn't color it at all. So I wanted to give it a little bit of shading. Another option here would be to use those masking sheets as well to create masks for your background and then do ink blending for these areas. But I like the combination of ink blended backgrounds with images colored with Copics. And these images are really quite striking, especially with that colored background. It just accentuates or kind of frames in the light colors from our images here. So once we have those done, I'm using some YG 63 and 93 for the grass. I want it to have a little bit more detail than just that ink blending on the background. So I'm starting off with the YG 63, coloring in those blades of the grass. Then I'm going in with the 67 and just adding a little bit of shading to it. Then back with that 63 just to blend those two colors together just a little bit. And you can see by adding those Copic markers on that grass, it just pops it out from the ink blended background of the grass. For the skin tone for the arm, I'm using E00 and E21. And again, if you want that arm to go all the way to the top, you can just easily cut it when you're doing your masking and make sure that it extends all the way to the outside of the cardstock. For this card, I'm thinking that it is Thing from Addams Family doing a little bit of golf. Why not? So once we have those images colored, and they came together super, super quickly because they're such simple images, I am using C7 and I'm just adding a border to all of these images. Another option here would be to use a black Copic marker. I'm using the long end of the chisel side of the marker. This is just a really great way to add a frame, make it look like it's matted. It blends in with the colors on the background, so it's not a stark color, which is why I chose the gray. But if you wanted it to be more stark and more striking and more bold, you could easily do black. I just wanted to frame that in a little bit and thought that that Copic marker would be the perfect thing for it. For the mat for my cards, I'm cutting pieces of Hammermill cardstock to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. For the first card, because there's not a whole lot of color to the background and I didn't want to blend either the green or the blue that we had in the background, I'm just using the C3 Copic marker. I started off using the chisel end, but I think my marker needs to be refilled because I didn't have a whole lot in that chisel end. So then I go with the brush side, using that side of the brush to just have that color on there. We could use some gray cardstock, but I didn't really have a gray that was a perfect match for the Copic marker. I really like using the markers that or the ink pads that I'm using in my coloring when I'm doing my mattes, because then I know I have a perfect color combination, a perfect match to the color in my image. So once I have that Copic edge done, I can glue this to the base of my A2 card, and then I can glue down my image piece. Set that to the side. We're going to do one more step to give it a little bit of extra dimension. For the next two cards, I'm using that worn lipstick distress ink around the outside of those mats. And just like doing my backgrounds, I don't make sure that we have a perfect blend around the outside. I have some areas that are lighter, some areas that are darker. Again, to me, it is a little bit more visually interesting to have some color variety, but if you want it to be all of the same shade, all of the same amount of ink, you absolutely can do that. So I'm just doing some of the ink around the outside edge so that we have that blending in with our sunset sky from our cards. Then we can assemble those cards together, putting the mat down first, and then we can put our image piece down. And I'm going to put an acrylic block on them just to hold it down nice and flat while it's drying. This just means that I can work on other things while that's drying. And really, it only takes a few seconds. I want to say like maybe 20 seconds that I have that on there, and then I set that aside to dry. We're going to assemble our third card here once again with the mat first and then our image piece. I'm using some Barely Art glue, and I have it in a fine line bottle. This is perfect for gluing things together because it gives you that little bit of wiggle room. I like using liquid glue for most of the things because you don't need to use a lot. It goes a long way, but it gives you that time to move and shimmy things in place. For one last step, one of the things that I love doing with my watercolor cards or just Copic marker cards is using different mediums to add extra texture. So here I'm using some glossy accents to add glossy domed texture to the golf ball in the first cards. For the third card, I'm going to do it on the golf club as well as the golf candle, just to give that a little bit of extra texture. Because we have Copic markers underneath and it's an alcohol-based marker, it's not going to change the color or bleed the color at all. It's just going to give those areas some domed dimension, and it gives a little bit of extra texture to colored and ink blended cards. So I let that dry for an hour before it was completely dry. When you first put it down, it's kind of like a hazy, milky look, and then it dries completely clear. You'll find everything that I've used listed and linked down in the description box below, but I love those colored scene backgrounds supporting each one of those images, just giving it a little bit more color and creating a scene out of the whole image. Thanks so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.